So now let's talk about a little bit more about positives and negatives in processing. You know, very often I'm finding, maybe half the time, when a person is complaining of something, which therefore is a negative, which is getting in the way of their goals, some feeling of disability or being opposed by the environment. It's interesting, but I'm finding that half the time you don't even have to process that. You know, you can ask the person, is there a positive ability underlying this? Is there a positive goal or something underlying this negative, which is what you want, and would you like to process that? And sometimes you can just directly process the positive. You know? And sometimes when you're processing a positive, the negatives will emerge. And that I'm going to talk about in more detail. But let me go back a little bit here. In the early Scientology research and development, from approximately 1951 to 1954, there was much attention on ascending to greater spiritual states of being, as Alan Walter called it, infinity of spirit, going in that direction. Taking knowledge from all quarters, some very promising results were obtained. The problem was that these results were neither uniform nor stable all too frequently, and so the direction turned increasingly to processing out the negatively charged material that either prevented success or caused a crash afterward. Unfortunately, the focus swung far too much on the negatives, which is where it kind of started from. You know, the premise of the Dianetics book was all you have to do is eliminate the negatives. That was, I think, one large reason why many people felt the book in those days ultimately failed to deliver its promise, for all the wonderful results that were gotten and the thrill of experiencing and recalling things they couldn't before, and being relieved of various types of unwanted feelings and sensations, was that the positives still weren't processed and addressed. And anyway, as I'm saying, the focus swung far too much on these negatives after this period of 1951 to 1954, roughly. You know, with the goal of research and processing largely modified and redirected to the mountainous approach of eliminating all negative material from the entirety of one's existence, which is essentially an endless effort to delete and delete and delete the bad stuff, you know, quote unquote, the bad stuff. You know, that in itself is not an end of a spiritual goal. It only needs to be removed as needed in relation to your particular goals, as fascinating as it can be. Take, for example, in the book Scientology 0 to 8, the Book of Scales, there is the state of case scale. And at the very top of this scale, as it was perceived and considered at this time, very top, and it was assigned the number 40.0, the very top, was simply no track, no charge. No track, no charge. In other words, elimination of all negatives. Positives were not even a consideration. Okay? Now, again, that's going to be, to some degree, a failed approach. Because the positives are what's really important to us. With the Dianetics book, there's a definition of clear early in that book. And pretty much all of us would agree that the promise of that definition of clear was never fully realized through Dianetics. It was a very, very worthwhile goal, and very exciting, and to a degree a person can understand how Ron Hubbard could expect achieving all these great abilities, but it was just elimination of negatives. And Hubbard had the idea that this could be achieved through a few hundred hours of Dianetics processing. I think that what's largely overlooked is that these estimates came about before the existence of the spirit and endless past lives went into the equation. And then if you look at it that way, frankly, if you're going to look for negative incidents until you can't find any more, until there's not any more, well, you can go on for any amount of lifetimes. You're never going to reach that point. It's basically as close to infinity as it gets to look for every negative experience any being has ever had. So if you decide, what happens is, and I've seen this with PCs in session, if you just process negatives and more negatives and more negatives, and I can process the hell out of negatives with power processing, which I've covered in another video, and blow them right out of the water and get, you know, great results where the person says, I don't even know what that was anymore, but whatever it was, it's gone. You know, that's great. That's important to the degree that those things were there for the person in the first place. But if you keep just directing to look for more negatives and more negatives, what else have you got that's negative? That kind of approach. You know, well, basically, now you're disorienting or redirecting that person to look for more negatives. And you know what? They'll come into session forever saying, here's the thing that's bothering me now. You know, and you don't want to do that to a person. That's really misdirecting them. You know, you want to know what's on their mind and what their goals are and process accordingly. You know, and that's the trap of what I think just solely going by the direction of negative processing, negative gain processing, or the book Dianetics, you know. It wasn't that Dianetic processing, which essentially is processing out harmful or painful incidents or incidents that brought about unconsciousness in the person. It's not that that isn't an incredible thing, it is, you know, but it just has to be taken within a bigger context of it's the positives that we're really after, you know, and process these negatives as needed. So, again, taking it from this point here of, you know, on this book of scales, the concept was the very highest level of spiritual being was no negatives. It's right on the state of case scale, no track, no charge. And I know people who have become focused that that's their ultimate goal, is no track, no charge. Well, you know, happy hunting, because that'll keep you busy forever. And it'll be a fun trip, but it's not going to, you know, it's not going to allow you to fully realize your powers and abilities, because it's not directed in that area at all. It's not directed positively. So to just go in that one direction, I think I'm making the point there. Okay, again, no track, no charge. There's no mention of positives. Okay. As I put it on paper, considering Scientology concepts of the sheer length of existence in universes in which time exists, you know, plumbing for all the negatives becomes a basically infinite job of plumbing depths for more and more negativity to process. This makes for a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of money spent in sessions trying to get there. And that may serve as motivation for a person or organization to promote that agenda. You know, well, people will be paying forever as long as they're willing to continue that way. But that is hardly in your own best interests, however painted as a necessary and rewarding system. Any discussion of positives in processing, we'll talk about positives now, should include mention of the case factor of identities, or what in Scientology terms is called valences, although valences, as conceived in Scientology, don't seem to fully convey the full dimension and importance, you know, of these. You know, I think it's somewhat, the description in Scientology as valences is somewhat superficial. Identities act as a fully developed personality, you know, and they have postulates, and they have futures and pasts, and attitudes and emotions and feelings, and they have behavior patterns, and their own ways of communicating, and their own limits and their own ceilings, and you know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, what can be and what can't be. You know, it's a frozen personality that cannot be changed. That's what an identity or valence is. But it is rich in quality of being a person in a lot of ways. Okay, and again, we speak of positives. We're talking about one's own goals and aspirations. Ron Hubbard made the observation in the 1950s, a lot of us are familiar with this and we've discussed it, that too much creative processing beefs up the bank. Those were Ron's words. Too much creative processing beefs up the bank. This was an observation he made. I know I've discussed this with auditors before, and creative processing essentially being positive processing, processing in the direction of abilities. The book Creation of Human Ability, an incredibly undervalued book. What a great book that is. And it's got all these created processes, not necessarily by Hubbard himself, but by that direction of processing in the direction of ability. Anyway, too much creative processing beefs up the bank. And this is based on, you just make it up. It was based on, this is what he observed. This is what happened. You run too much, quote unquote, too much creative processing. And the person would just run into charge and an inability to process greater abilities. They'd hit a wall, okay? And Ron just kind of left it at that, just kind of dropped it at that, that processing positives, goals, abilities, and better states of being eventually hits into some kind of resistance from the case. And, what I used to think was that, well, maybe that was overrun phenomena. We have this idea in Scientology of overrun, But I've come to think differently about what an overrun really is now, okay? I think that the only true overrun is trying to run out a specific incident that's already been run out, forcing the person to, crunch themselves into trying to recreate it, and that's a bad thing. And that was the original definition of overrun. The truth is, there is much processing techniques that can be run again and again and again when it's right for the person. We have this idea that's been spread in Scientology where we have a grade chart, a bridge, where you do this process, then that process. You get the result of this process, then you get the result of that process. Well, that word "the," okay, should be stricken from the terminology, in my opinion. You get a result, okay? You get what for that moment is what the person is going to get out of that process. To define it as the only summation of what they will get and can get out of the process is incorrect. There are many processes that later on could be run again. Not immediately. The person's just gotten what they could get out of it at that moment. But it doesn't mean that later on they can't run that to a much greater degree of ability. Anyway, in terms of beefing up the bank when running too much creative processing, another Scientology researcher named John Galusha, largely forgotten, but a very interesting, very intelligent man. He came to understand, somehow, maybe he just intuited this, I don't know, but that that beefing up the bank was that, we're all dramatizing a catalog of identities or valences, depending on the solution that's being employed at that particular moment, which identity or valence we're operating. We got tons of them. And when you do creative processing, you're not processing a pure being. You're processing, we are composites, okay? We have all kinds of attitudes and feelings that are from adopted beingnesses, personalities, persona, identity, whatever word you prefer, but these are personalities. So when you process towards a particular ability, let's say the ability to experience energy, okay, the ability to perceive any ability you could think of, okay? The degree to which the person's going to be able to actually process that ability to realizing it to greater levels is limited by the ceiling of whatever identity they're viewing things from. An identity has perceptions, it has limitations. It's a fixed solution. Any personality we take on tons of them. There's a lot to process there for most of us. Anyway, so that's what was really happening, and this is what John Galusha observed, was that the degree to which a person could benefit from creative processing was the degree to which the personality or identity they were currently wearing could expand. Whatever the limitations of that created or adopted personality were, that was the limit to which the creative processing was accessible for the person. And when you mock up a personality, you take on or adopt, your mother or your father, somebody you saw in a movie, somebody from a past incident, somebody who dominated, whatever. All of those are constructions, they're constructions. And constructions are not inherently elastic and expandable to any degree. They have their limitations. And if you go beyond the ability, try to go beyond the ability of any particular identity, it wouldn't be that identity anymore. So it resists going beyond that ability. And that is the case resistance that Hubbard observed as too much creative processing beefs up the bank. So we really do need to process these identities if we're going to fully be able to realize positive gain processing. That's a big part of positive gain processing. So we need to discuss that a little bit. That pushback from the identity is the beefing up of the bank. The identity says, oh no, this is me. It's like trying to put too much air into a balloon and it bursts.